Well, next up, we have the 12 steps, and tonight, Fariel is going to read those for us. Just got to unmute her here.
Yeah, it's good now. Hi, everybody. Farrell, alcoholic, part of the Friday Night Gratitude group and the Nightly Review group, and I am an alcoholic. These are the 12 steps. 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7, humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10, continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Thanks, Dustin.
Thanks, Fariel. And next up, we have the 12 traditions, and my friend Jeremy's going to do those for us.
Hi everyone, Jeremy, alcoholic, member of the Zoom Nightly Review group and the fellowship group here in Toronto, Canada. The 12 traditions. 1, our common welfare should come first. Personal welfare depends upon AA unity. 2, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as He may express Himself in our group conscious. Our group leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. 3, the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. 4, each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. 5, each group has but one primary purpose, to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. 6, an AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. 7, every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. 8, Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever unprofessional, but our service centers may employ special workers. 9, AA as such ought never be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. 10, Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues, hence the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. 11, our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. 12, anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities.
Thanks, Jeremy. Awesome. Thanks to readers, Jeremy and Fariel. So just before we introduce the speaker, I just want to send my sincere gratitude and thanks to all of you. This tonight is our last night here at the Saturday Night Speaker Series, and it's been an incredible experience for all of us involved. So on behalf of myself, Shauna, and Rob, we just want to thank you all for the support. And it's been quite an interesting experience, this whole COVID thing, but it's been absolutely inspiring, especially for someone who's relatively new to sobriety like myself, to see the way that the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous comes together in time of need, and we made it work, right? And I think that has very little to do with all of us and everything to do with God, right? Just amazing. It's been super cool to see. So I just want to thank all of you for your support, and now I'll introduce the speaker. So tonight, our speaker will be sharing for approximately 1 hour. Our speaker comes to us from Toronto, Ontario, and the committee is pleased to introduce Josh H. Where is he? Oh, gotta get a...
Joshua Alcoholic.
Hey, Josh.
For First off, Dustin, thanks for asking me to be here on what I now discovered is a civic holiday long weekend, which I didn't know before when I agreed to do this. But I'm glad to be here. I just kind of flipping through can see that I know a lot of you. It's nice to be around some people that I know. I hope I don't get distracted. I pinned the ASL speaker to my other screen because I thought that was interesting, and it's sort of distracting me. I don't know if I should have done that. I was eavesdropping as I came in and just kind of listening to people talking about the meetings in this format. And this, not that anyone's counting, but I think this is the 40th meeting I've spoken at since COVID started. And the real loser in that has been my wife, because she's had to listen to me every single time. But it has been interesting. It's one of those things where I've discovered I have a much lower tolerance to hear my story than I thought. The other is because you have this sort of weird affect of, you can actually watch yourself when you speak, which is not something you can do in person unless someone's just like randomly holding up a mirror. And you can also just watch yourself in meetings. And what I discovered is that the expression on my face is often not the expression I think I have, which is a lot of times I think I'm smiling and I'm totally not, which was an interesting journey to find out. And I've found that, because you don't have any sort of instantaneous feedback, it's often just people's expressions that kind of help give you life. And so as a form of showing up to meetings, I've been over-exaggerating my facial expressions to kind of help people. And what it made me think of is I was speaking at a meeting in Oklahoma a couple weeks ago. And during my talk, there's this one particular woman who was just really into it, like just laughing and nodding and smiling the whole time and just kind of giving me life throughout the talk. And they had this thing at the end where there's about 10 minutes where people could share, and she shared, and I was just waiting for whatever wonderful experience she had had. And she's like, I just want to apologize. There was something wrong with my audio, and I actually could not hear the speaker. So she was just laughing and nodding and smiling and had no idea what I was saying. So I don't know if it's a better compliment that was the experience for her not hearing what I was saying, but that was an interesting lesson. And the other is, I've had some really cool, like what Dustin said is this period of time has kind of afforded us a unique glimpse into Alcoholics Anonymous in a way that's not typically available unless you just happen to travel a ton. And I do travel a ton, and even like the level of, I guess, accessibility to AA around the world during this period of time is not what I'm normally used to. I was speaking to a woman that was part of a small meeting in Ireland, and she said the thing that saved that group was this young millennial that had gotten sober not long before this happened, that was like the only person at the group that had any idea about how to migrate them to Zoom. And as a result of that, they had this kind of like really vibrant old timer meeting in Ireland as a result of like this single newcomer that was coming to the meeting that knew how to work a computer. And my Saturday morning meeting that I go to is one in Tokyo because I've been to it before in real life, and it's filled with friends of mine. And it gives me this kind of cool thing where every Saturday I just get to touch base with the people that I know in Tokyo and see other people. So that's been really interesting. The other cool thing is I'm speaking at a pretty decently attended meeting. I'm wearing a nice shirt, and otherwise I'm wearing sweatpants, and nobody knows except for the fact that I just kind of let on. So this is purely the age of like business top and sweatpants bottom period of AA, which I don't mind. And it's great to be here. It's the other thing I'll say is I've been sober for almost 25 years, and my experience in AA has been that we are a wonderful group of people, but we're slow to change. We typically, and I think not in a bad way, but we try to take our time when implementing things. And I think mid-March, I was flying out to Chicago to speak at a conference, and it was Friday, and things had started to get kind of wild in the States. And I was more or less just waiting for them to cancel the conference, but otherwise I was like up to the last minute waiting to go to the airport. And literally right before I left, like word came in that Chicago had shut down, and like you literally could not fly there. And shortly after that, Alcoholics Anonymous went online. Like, an entire fellowship that has only known the experience for the most part of being in-person meetings, just suddenly appeared online like en masse. And it's been really cool to see, because for me, that is ultimately the spirit of Alcoholics Anonymous, is that in a time of need, we stepped up in a way that was pretty amazing to witness. And I think it gets summarized by just that conversation I had with that woman in Ireland, where every group member had some sort of purpose, regardless of how long they'd been sober, regardless of how old they were, only because they just happened to know how to download Zoom on a computer. And it's been crazy, because it's not like a pandemic stops people from needing to get sober. In fact, I would imagine that this is a period of time where a lot of people are finding that they need to get sober. My experience of been in meetings is that there's definitely not a shortage of newcomers. The other thing that's been happening is in my home group, which meets on Mondays, my commitment currently is I'm what we call the fellowship coordinator. So during the meeting, I communicate with the newcomers. Like what we do is we find out who the newcomers are, and we're like, if you need to get in contact with other members or find other meetings, chat with me during the meeting, and I'll make sure to stay after the meeting with you, and we can make sure to get you connected in AA. And so as a result of that, I've kind of had these ongoing relationships with a number of newcomers, which isn't really dissimilar to real life. But I think it's opened me up to conversations with them that I may normally have not had. And what I've been finding that's interesting is a lot of them have actually loved this. Like a common story I've heard is that they have previously tried to get sober in AA, and for whatever reason, they found it difficult. I mean, it could be any number of reasons. This is also the hearsay coming from a newcomer. But what they said they liked is this whole kind of being online has put Alcoholics Anonymous in a form of accessibility that they hadn't experienced before, like the ability to attend a meeting outside of the region that they live in, connect with people in a way that they hadn't been previously. And I find that really interesting. I think, well, I hope that this will become more of a historical point in AA and not sort of the norm. And we'll kind of look back at it, and a lot of interesting stories are going to come out of it, as they already have, such as that one about that woman who was really enjoying my talk but could not hear it. Otherwise, yeah, I'm glad to be here. I apologize if I'm a little scattered. That's kind of the norm, to be honest. But it's more so over this particular format. It's easy to forget what the hell you're talking about for some reason when you're just dealing with a computer screen as opposed to real people. And it's also interesting in the sense that I have found most of my things in life, the more I do it, the better I get. Speaking has been one of those things that apparently has been very resistant to that. I feel like I get worse every single time I do it. And you're sort of at the tail end of, I don't know, number 43. So I apologize ahead of time, because I think each talk is degraded from that point on. But just to give you the vital signs, my sobriety date is October 22nd, 1995. Like I said, I'll be 25 years sober in October. I was 19 years old when I got sober, and I've spent over 50% of my life active in Alcoholics Anonymous. I feel incredibly grateful for that. That was definitely not how I felt when I first got sober. My sponsor is a guy named Dan F., who's kind of this prolific guy in Toronto that goes to the Hill Group. And legend has it that at his group, when it was in person, he would sit at the back of the room, so that when newcomers would come into the meeting, who typically wouldn't sit at the front of the room, he would be there to turn around and greet them and say, "My name's Stan. I'm an alcoholic. Glad to have you here." Which is kind of a dick move if you're a newcomer and you're sort of just trying to hide in the shadows. But I like that about him, because it sort of goes against this idea of, like, if you're an active member, you sit up front, which I guess I understand the sentiment behind, but it's a stupid saying. Because it's sort of like, if you're an active member, the place you should be is the place where the non-active members are, so that you can show them what an active member looks like. And I take that lesson from Dan, because he's one of those guys that, similar to basically all the sponsors I've had, has never presented himself as anything more than he is, which is just a guy that's been sober for a long time in AA, and has been my sponsor for like 15 years, basically because he loves AA. Like, he feels that he has an unpayable debt to sobriety. He believes that he has a duty to carry the message. And he also believes that it's one of the things that can help keep him sober. And the other interesting thing about Dan is, because he sponsored me for so long, I've had the opportunity to see him change as a person, like see his own perceptions on things, his own ideas. Years ago, there was this kind of controversy going around, well, at least Toronto, about certain meetings. And Dan and I had gotten together and we're talking about it. And while we were talking about it, it became clear that both him and I had different opinions on the matter. Not in any really argumentative way. I've never actually had an argument with Dan. But it was just clear that we both had different opinions. And at the end of it, we kind of just had one of those friendly, well, I guess we'll agree to disagree, and went our separate ways. And then a couple of weeks later, we got back together and we're talking about it. And he was like, I just wanted to let you know, I've thought a lot more about what you said and I've changed my mind. And I was like, oh, because I also thought a lot about what you said and I've kind of changed my mind as well. And I love that about him, because I think he just celebrated his 36th year sober or something like that. He's about 10 years more than me. But he's a dude where, when provided with other evidence, he's willing to change his mind about something. And I love that about him, because for me, ultimately what I want is, at any point in time in my sobriety, to be able to be teachable, to remain agile enough in my philosophies and ideas about spirituality, my own life, and AA, that I'm capable of changing my mind. Bill W., in a letter that he wrote in the Grapevine, said that he believed that the greatest danger in Alcoholics Anonymous would be rigidity, in as much that the greatest danger that we faced would be, as a fellowship, to reach a place where we were incapable of changing our minds about any particular topic. And I love that about this program. I mean, I ultimately think it's one of the things that separates us from a cult. We're a little bit cult-like, but ultimately we're not a cult. And our ability to change our views on things is kind of one of those things. And my favorite part in the big book is the appendix 2 about the spiritual experience. And the reason I love that particular thing is, one is it resonates with me more based on the level of what my own experience with spirituality is. But in the beginning of that, what it describes, or kind of paraphrased of what it says, is we talked, or rather Bill W. offered his experience with what the spiritual kind of awakening in his life looked like. And it was sort of this momentous, bright light, instantaneous experience. And it was like, after further review, we've come to find that that's actually not that common with most members, that experience doesn't happen for most of us. And rather, a lot of us experience something that we call something of an educational variety. And again, it's a part of the book that's basically saying that after a period of time, when presented with different evidence, we sort of changed our mind about something as critical as the spiritual experience. And I find that amazing that in our book it says that. It's just all these things that make me love being a part of this. The other is, my home group is the Corktown group on Mondays, and we're a great group, and I've enjoyed being part of it. It's one of the many meetings in Toronto that I helped start. It's sort of one of my hobbies, is that I like starting meetings, which I'll get into in a bit. There's really nothing noble about it. I just tend to get bored and start new meetings. They're also generally suspiciously very close to where I live. And I've moved physically into the city a number of times. This meeting, when we meet in person, is 2 blocks from where I live. And but there is actually, this might be the only meeting where there was something of a noble purpose. And that purpose was this. We live in a place called Corktown in Toronto, which is near the Distillery District. And in our kind of immediate region, there isn't any physical meetings. And we have a friend that did live in this neighborhood years back. And at that time, she was pregnant. And we were talking, and she was like, I feel like if there isn't a meeting that I can walk to, I'm going to have a real hard time getting to meetings, being pregnant or with a newborn. And we were like, well, why don't we just start a meeting like right here, like literally just right over there. And so we did, for our pregnant friend. And it's weirdly become a haven for pregnant women. Like, there's a lot of pregnant women, or previously pregnant women, I should say. And in fact, the women's meeting that meets online that's sort of connected to this group is primarily pregnant women. So if you are expecting, or you have a newborn and you're a woman, apparently it's a great group. I don't go to it, but that's sort of the theme of that group. When things get back to normal, and if you ever find yourself in the Corktown area, also as a newly pregnant woman, that's apparently our jam. So feel free to drop in. And yeah, and I've been active in AA for all of my sobriety, with the exception of one blip, which I'll probably go into when I talk about step one. And it's been a phenomenal journey. Like, yeah, it's really been cool. I think maybe the only advantage of speaking a lot is it does make me very reflective on kind of my experience in sobriety. And it has, in particular, made me very grateful these days about just being part of this thing. One of the common things I've been hearing in meetings, in Zoom meetings, is that alcoholics are perhaps more uniquely qualified to deal with this pandemic. I don't actually know if that's true. I'm actually a little bit skeptical of that alcoholics are more uniquely qualified for it. I think that we have probably more resources to deal with it, particularly the ability to connect to a large, like, active social group on a continuous basis that we do. But from listening to people share in meetings and also talking to friends that are not alcoholics, I don't necessarily know if we're handling this any better or any worse. There's people that are definitely in my meetings having a really difficult time at this. And if you're new or not new and you're struggling with this and you feel that maybe you're struggling with this time because it's something to do with your program, I don't know if that's true. I think this is just a difficult time for a lot of people. But there is one thing that I do think that uniquely qualifies us for this thing, and that's actually more of a defect, which is the alcoholic trait of being able to normalize catastrophe or crisis. Like our ability to basically sit in the chair while the house is burning down and go, this is all right. That might be a little bit helpful right now, which is probably good. But I'm going to get into my story because I'm starting to just get off track, and it's like almost 8:30. Anyway, I was 19 years old, and I came out of what I'm hoping was my last blackout. I was at that time face down in the Mojave Desert, dressed like Mickey Mouse. I do remember now why that happened, but at the moment, I didn't know why that happened. I was a blackout drinker all of my drinking career. Because I started drinking when I was 10 years old, at that time I was physically about the size of a large owl. So it wasn't difficult for me to drink beyond what my weight limit allowed for. And so I was a blackout drinker from the beginning and was a blackout drinker from the very end. And I was actually, I guess, a little bit startled to find out that that's not that common to be a blackout drinker to that extent. I had spent my entire drinking time assuming that everybody else was also in blackouts, and was mildly horrified to find out that most people totally were not and remembered everything that was going on, whereas I did not. And my blackouts were so severe that in the end, one of the things that I was doing was attending AA meetings while in blackouts, which is horrible. And I always share that because if you are new and you're having that experience of going to meetings and blackouts, that at the very least means that any recreational drinking you had left in your life is probably over. Because what that means is if you can consider blackout you as this almost separate entity that has the ability to make decisions on its own with its own agenda and own motivations, that means even super drunk you is like, you got to stop drinking, and is taking you to AA meetings. I remember the last time I'd experienced that, I was in Los Angeles, which is where I'm originally from. And I had somehow made my way into this group called the Pacific Group, which is a gigantic group in Brentwood that on a normal Wednesday night is like 1,200 people. And I just recall coming out of a blackout when they finished reading the steps and just looking around and going, oh shit, I'm in an AA meeting. And that was like what the best of my drinking was like at that point in time. And funny enough, I spoke at the Pacific Group during this time too. So that was a nice thing. I think that was the first time I'd ever gotten to share that I had a bit of time attending that meeting in blackouts, which is actually not that uncommon. I mean, any large group, there's like a fairly good chance that somebody is there at least totally wasted or perhaps in a blackout. And I always get a little bit amused when alcoholics put like a white glove up to their hand and go, oh my God, like someone's drunk in a meeting. And it's like, you remember like the first word in the program that we're at, which is alcoholic. It's like, these are the type of people that not only do we exist to serve, but like literally attract is alcoholics, whether or not they've stopped drinking. And so I come out of this blackout, and as a career blackout drinker, as any of you who also were blackout drinkers know, you develop certain skills that are unique to that type of drinking. Kind of like the ability to, when coming out of a blackout in an unknown situation, you sort of can slow down time and take in all of the surrounding elements and put together how it is that you arrived in the Mojave Desert face down, dressed like Mickey Mouse, kind of like CSI AA or something. And for me, I had been at a desert rave party. If you were ever in the 90s dropping a lot of acid and going to raves in the desert, you probably already know why I was dressed like Mickey Mouse. If you didn't, don't worry about it. But so I figure out what's going on, and I make my way to this nearby mining town and call the guy that would end up being my sponsor. And he asked a couple very key questions. One of the most important ones being, how are you doing? And after I kind of gave him a synopsis of how I was doing, he was like, why don't you come meet me and we can talk about taking this thing serious. And so I made my way down to Laguna Beach where he lived, and him and I were walking along this really kind of idyllic boardwalk in Laguna Beach. And we're having this kind of like high level conversation about how the way to remove my alcoholism would be some sort of personal relationship with a higher power, which was mostly going over my head at that moment. But as we're walking along the boardwalk, this other dude seems to materialize out of thin air. And he looks straight at me and he points and he's like, hey man, I'll trade you your cigarettes for some hash, which was like a pretty good deal. Like on a purely transactional basis was a really good deal. And I definitely thought about it for a moment. And my sponsor did something that I've always been grateful for, which is he looked at me, he looked at the guy, and he stepped back and he put his hands up and he's like, hey, it's up to you. You got to make the decision. And I've always felt that if he had tried to in any way intervene with what I was supposed to do, or just straight up told me what I was supposed to do, I might not have stayed sober. And I think part of that was because I was like pathologically incapable of taking direction from somebody that I thought was coming from some kind of form of authority. But when he told me, or rather suggested to me, that it was my decision, like I heard that, and I was like, oh yeah, I guess if I really want to stay sober, this is probably going to be the first of one of many decisions that I have to make. And so against my better judgment, I turned that man down, and he faded back into the shadows from whence he came. And I have never again had such a good deal appear in my life. And I would be dishonest if I said there haven't been some times where I've thought back to that time and slightly regretted it. And me and my sponsor continued along the boardwalk. And this is the thing about my first sponsor, Scott, which, oh, by the way, another cool thing about this period of time is I had Scott speak at my home group, which was really cool. And the way I describe him is exactly how he showed up like 20 plus years later. And he was a guy that I chose as my sponsor because he had an afro, which I thought was super cool. He always wore tie-dye, which he personally made himself. And he carried a boomerang around in public, like in its own personal boomerang holster that I'm pretty sure he made himself, like this leather holster. And I remember when I told a friend that, they were like, wasn't that weird to you that you were like meeting up with this dude that was carrying around a boomerang in person, like in public? And I was like, well, there's a lot of stuff going on in my life at that time. And that really wasn't something that kind of met the bar of a red flag at that time of my life. And him and I are walking along, and he's like, for your first act of surrender, I want you to take this boomerang. And he like unsheathed the boomerang and tried to hand it to me. And he's like, I want you to take it and throw it. And I was like, no. And he was like, well, why not? I was like, because I'll hit somebody. And he's like, well, that's not really how boomerangs work. And I had to admit to myself, I didn't really know how boomerangs work. I'd never actually thrown one. So again, I took that act of surrender and I took the boomerang and I just threw it as hard as I could and nailed this guy like in the back of the head along the beach. And my sponsor ran out onto the beach and was like, sorry, he's a newcomer, which is like, that's AA talk. That's not like beach lingo. So in no way did he even describe to that man who I hit in the back of the head with a boomerang as to why that event had just occurred. And I remember my sponsor running back after having retrieved that boomerang with this big grin on his face and having my first resentment against him. And then he took me to not my first meeting, but the first meeting that would be within this period of sobriety. And him and I went to that meeting, and I have a couple memories. One of them being what I was wearing. I don't know why I know that, but I can remember with vivid detail exactly what I was wearing. The other thing I can remember is I was met at the door by this big guy named Frank, and he said to me, "You're no longer alone." And I took that as a threat. I didn't know that that was an AA slogan. I just thought there was some dude threatening me at the doorstop of AA. I kind of assumed he meant like, don't drink because we're watching you, buddy. The other thing that I remember is in Southern California, they do this thing where everyone in the first 90 days stands up and introduce themselves and how long they've been sober, so that people can like come up to you and help you, I guess. And I got up and I said, this is my first day sober. And as I was sitting down, this guy sitting in front of me turned around and handed me a card. And on that card, just this heavy white card stuck with bright, bold black letters. It said Ron W., had his phone number, and then 24 hours. And he was like, "Hey, man, next time you want to drink, call me first." And then smiled at me really smugly, and then turned around and sat down. And I was like, well, this guy doesn't want to stay sober. He wants to go drinking with me, because I didn't really have any frame of reference as to what exactly he was offering. It just sounded like a guy that's like, hey, I'd like to go out drinking, but I'd rather do it with someone that I just met at this meeting. So here's my offer. The other is I remember the speaker at that meeting, and I had that sort of cliched experience where it felt like someone had called ahead and was like, hey, listen, this jackass is coming to the meeting. Here's the stuff I want you to talk about that relates to his life. And I felt like that. And the funny thing about that guy, who I would become to know quite well throughout my sobriety, was if there existed a guy that had like the exact opposite of my story, it was that speaker that night. But for whatever reason, I felt myself incapable of not relating to things that he was talking about. And some of them were like totally ridiculous things. For example, I remember his story was that he was a naval admiral, and he was also a blackout drinker. And he would like be on shore leave and get into a blackout drunk and forget where he'd parked the boat. And I was like, I forget stuff when I'm in blackouts. And just all these things that he was saying that it felt like the most minute thing I related to. But I remember that experience, like I hold that experience close to my heart, because ultimately it was that thing that allowed me to stay in AA. The inability to not relate to what was being said, even if it was at times some of the most minute stuff. And it wasn't like I was making an effort. I just found my place. I found myself in this place where I related to everything that people said, and that was new to me. And even though in that moment it seemed to come without effort, the longer I stay sober, the more effort sometimes it takes to have that kind of attitude. But I have to remember that that's what keeps me grounded in AA. And if I find myself sitting in a meeting and thinking like, what is this person talking about? I don't relate to anything this person says. I remind myself that that's not what kept me sober. I think that kind of means what it means to be back to basics, is to even just get back to that attitude that allowed me to stay in the beginning of early sobriety. And so me and my sponsor started working the steps right away. I have friends, and I often hear people who have stayed sober in AA for substantial periods of time, like sometimes years, before they ever work the steps. And God bless your spiritually sadomasochistic soul, but that was not my experience. And to be honest, I didn't even know that was an option. It definitely was presented to me like it's not an option. I didn't know you weren't allowed to work the steps. I probably would have chosen that if I'd known that. But my sponsor and the people he hung out with were sort of like, I mean, if you want to stay, this is what you got to do. And so we started working step one on day one. And my sponsor gave me the space to tell my story. And he told his story. And the sort of brilliant thing about my sponsor giving me the time to talk about my own story was he was kind of doing it so he could use those stories against me at a future date, which he would do quite often, in a very sort of ingenious way to help me understand the steps. Because ultimately, the one thing I could never disagree with was my own experiences. It's not like he'd say, well, no, because that didn't happen to me. He's like, well, I mean, I'm literally talking about something that happened to you as admitted by you. For the time that I've been sober, Jesus Christ, I have 20 minutes left. I'm like on step one. I will tell a story that more applies about step one to my life today. And that relates to sort of what I discovered about my own alcoholism after having worked the steps and been sober for a while. And that experience was this. When I was 4 years sober, I moved out of Los Angeles to kind of this rural area in southern Turkey. And I worked at this like resort, this beach resort, basically. I don't know why I did it. It was sort of an impulsive thing that was sort of common for things that I did around 4 years sober. I'm glad I did it. It was kind of a cool experience. But I also naively believed that AA existed everywhere in the exact same form that I knew of it in Los Angeles, which was entirely untrue. What I found out was AA did not exist at all where I moved to. I moved to Turkey in sort of the mid to late 90s. At that point in time, it had only recently changed political rulings, where previously it had been sort of run by this, I guess, alt-right religious government. And there were still a lot of things in place, such as AA was considered a religious organization and literally couldn't exist at penalty of law. And it just wasn't around, which I found out. And what I found was I had this experience where I walked into this store in the area that I lived. And while I was standing there, I looked over and saw that there was this beer and there was this water, and the beer was cheaper than the water. And I had this very clear thought come into my head, which was, you are a fundamentally irresponsible person when it comes to finances. Like, you have never had a budget. You've never dealt with money. Here is potentially a really good place to start. The beer is cheaper than the water. And I had that thought, and it seemed like really logical. Like, in fact, it seemed pretty responsible. And I sat with that thought for longer than I had entertained any thought of drinking for a while. And then it was like I snapped out of it and was scared by that. And I went back, and that same day, my roommate threw down a brick of hash on our nightstand and was like, hey, I just scored this. If you want some, feel free. It's also yours. And I thought, I am in trouble. And this is what happened is, through any number of means, the thought of drinking and using entered my mind. It was not the first time since I had been sober that that had happened, but it was the first time that I seemed incapable of getting rid of it. With no intent of drinking, no wanting to drink, I just could not stop drinking about it. And what happened is the obsession had returned, and I had no way to really treat it. And I called my sponsor, and I was like, this is what's going on. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. And he was like, well, what it occurs to me is you have three options. One is you can drink, because it sounds like that might be where you're headed. Two is you can always come home. And three is, if AA doesn't exist out there, you'll have to start it. And I was like, I don't want to drink. Like, I know that right now, that I don't want to drink, even though there's a part of me that says I do. I also don't want to come home. So I guess I'll start AA. And I did. I was in southern Turkey. And what I had found is there's this group of 5 Muslim guys that had come from a really small village and were kind of almost Orthodox Muslim. They were not supposed to be drinking. We were in this very kind of young, party-centric environment, and they were constantly tempted and struggled with that. And they often hung out with me because I was one of the only people that didn't drink. And they were often very fascinated also by the fact that I didn't do that, because I would sometimes tell them stories about how I totally used to. And so they were very fascinated by that. And so I approached them and I said, hey, listen, do you guys want to know and learn about why and how it is that I don't drink? And they were like, yeah, totally. And so the AA that I started there was me and these 5 Muslim guys meeting up a couple times a week in my room and reading the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. We did that for a while, and it quite literally saved my life. And here's the interesting thing about that period of time. In hindsight, I don't actually think any one of those guys were alcoholics. I think they weren't supposed to be drinking. They wanted not to drink. And they also were struggling on doing that on their own. And I think most importantly, they also wanted to learn English, which I was helping them do for free. They were learning a lot of weird terms like rigorous honesty, and this is sort of why I realized the whole English thing is because we would get stuck on things that had nothing to do with alcoholism. And they were more like the English side of it. But the weird thing is, going through the big book to that level of minutia where it was just basically trying to help someone understand English, gave me so much insight into the book in a way that I had never had before. And there was no one except for me to guide me along. And I was trying to do all this research to better trying to describe this thing. And I got super interested in the AA history at that time because of that, because they'd be like, what are they talking about with this thing? Who are the Washingtonians? Like, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't know. And so I would kind of do this research. So the next time I had something interesting to tell them. And God bless them. Either they feigned a lot of interest in this, or they were legitimately just interested in this kind of side of Western culture that they would have otherwise had no access into. But it awakened this kind of thing where I was like, AA is like a fascinating place. And that time saved my life. And when my sponsor around step 1 asked me if I was willing to go to any lengths to stay sober, I said yes, because what kind of idiot would say that when someone asks you that kind of question? But I didn't know that that's what he might have been talking about. Like, I didn't know when he asked me that question, he might have been asking, are you willing, if for some reason you find yourself in rural Turkey where AA is basically against the law, to start AA with a bunch of dudes that are possibly not even alcoholics and go through the entire book like a English teacher? And I didn't know that's what I was saying yes to, but ultimately that is what I was saying yes to. And that's what I remember about step 1. Not only what it possibly might mean to say I'm willing to go to any lengths, but also that I am willing to go to any lengths. That is part of what admitting powerlessness is. I was listening to this interview once of people who had been through traumatic events, and they were talking about to people who had been taken hostage for long periods of time. And they're discussing Stockholm syndrome, which if for some reason you know what that is, it's this phenomenon that occurs where sometimes when people are taken hostage, they develop like a form of sort of affection toward their hostage takers, and will often focus on the most minute of positive traits that they observe in these people. And in the absence of any positive traits, they'll just fabricate them as a way of basically dealing with sort of the trauma of the event that's going on. And in its most extreme cases, they'll sometimes like help the hostage takers commit crimes, like with Patty Hearst. And they were interviewing this one guy, and he had been taken hostage for a long period of time. And they were like, what frightens you after having going through this? Like, what are the things that frighten you today? And he was like, well, the thing that frightens me today is not long ago, I found myself in this like kind of mentally unguarded position. And during that period of time, I started nostalgically thinking back on those captors and having these like feelings of like, oh, I miss those guys. What a great time. And he knows intellectually of how horrible of a time it was and how horrible of a people those were and the events that happened to him and other people as a result of that. But in this unguarded moment, he found himself wistfully thinking back on it and only able to think of what was essentially an illusion of what had happened in that period of time. And he said, that scared the hell out of me. It was like in that moment, I'd lost every form of self-agency, and I literally could not even trust my own reality. And when I heard that, I was like, damn, that's basically my relationship with alcohol, Stockholm syndrome. And the big book points that out in a number of different ways, where it says, as alcoholics, we lack the ability to recall with any form of alacrity the nightmare of what it is to drink, if even but moments ago. Like after having gone through a horrible thing as a result of drinking, we'll sit back and go, wow, glad that wasn't as a result of drinking. And like we are incapable of remembering what had happened, both in a physiological sense, whether it be from blackouts or this form of internal insanity where we just cannot realistically see what our drinking is doing in our lives. And that's why I think in AA it's important to talk about our drinking. Sometimes people will say, I'm not going to talk about my drinking because you all know how it is to drink. The reality is, as alcoholics, we literally don't know what it was like to drink. Like, we don't know how we were drinking. We don't know the effect it was causing in our life. The only reason we're getting sober is because of a number of things. We only slightly have begun to realize that, or we suddenly started listening to all the other people who have realized that for years. But otherwise, a lot of us come in with a very ambiguous idea of what our drinking actually was like. And I think that moment of listening to another alcoholic tell their story and then suddenly go, oh shit, that's how I drank. And I literally did not know that until I heard that other person talk about it, is kind of this amazing thing about what we do. And so we start working on step 2, and I get freaked out about all these ideas of faith and religion, primarily from a misinterpretation of what it was that ultimately the big book was talking about. And I remember telling my sponsor, thank you for taking the time to do this with me, but if this is what's required for me to stay sober, I don't think I'll be able to. Like, I don't think I can have faith in something. I've just never done that before. And he was like, funny you say that. Let me tell you a story. And he told me my story. And that story was this, which was a story I had told him. When I was 16 years old, I was serving a 2-year consecutive stay in juvenile hall because of what at that time I would have called bad luck and poor timing. And when I was in juvenile hall, there was sort of this thing, general rule of thumb, as we called it, that if you're in the doctor's office and you saw medication, you stole it. And so this one time I was in the doctor's office and I saw this box of medication, and on the box it showed 2 old people walking down the beach hand in hand and had the words, "For the ease of pain and discomfort." And I stole it, assuming it was muscle relaxants, which is sort of one of my favorite things. And I smuggled it back into the place and shared it with my friends. And about an hour later, it occurred to me that 2 old people walking down the beach hand in hand and the words, "For the ease of pain and discomfort," we had all just overdosed on prescription strength laxatives. And for the next couple hours, we would turn our will and our lives over to a power greater than we understood. And the reason my sponsor used that particular story to help me understand step 2 was his point was this: you have lived your entire life based on faith. In that moment, the only evidence you had required to turn your will and your life over to something was a picture of 2 old people walking down the beach hand in hand and the words, "For the ease of pain and discomfort," and instantly you turn your will and your life over to it, convinced that it would take you where you wanted to go. Definitively, that is faith. And when he said that, I saw it. I understood what he was talking about. He said it wasn't the quantity of faith in your life you'd lacked, it was the quality of faith. You've just never really had faith in something that was worth having faith in. And that made sense to me. And that allowed me to move on to step 3. And what time do I end, Dustin? At 9? Because I'm screwed if that's true. Yeah, let's say I'm ending at 9. Anyway, so that helped me understand step 2. And because I just said I'm going to end at 9, and that's like 8 minutes away, and I'm on step 2, I should talk a little bit about my drinking, because that was also part of step 1. And I'll tell 2 stories. One of them is my first drink, because my sponsor really loved that story. And I did too. I've come to find that it's not exclusively alcoholic, but as an alcoholic, we really have an understanding about our first drink that I think normal people don't have. Like, a lot of our first drink stories are like on the quality of like superhero origin stories. Like those stories where the superhero suddenly discovers that they have superpowers. Like, that's often our first drinking stories are like that. And for me, I was 10 years old and I'm at a party and we start drinking vodka and Kool-Aid and we start shooting fireworks at cars, which where I come from is illegal. And the cops start chasing us and they corner us in a field and they're asking us our names and our phone numbers. All of my friends are shaken up and they're giving up that information quickly. And when the cop gets to me, I begin to feel the effects of alcohol for the first time in my life. And he's like, "What's your name?" And I'm like, "My name is Richard Head." And the cop is like, "Son, are you trying to tell me your name is Dickhead?" And I was like, "Well, sir, I've always preferred the name Richard." And the cop like looks at me and laughs and nudges his buddy. And then they just let us all go free with no consequences. And me and my friends are walking away from that and they're patting me on the back and they're saying that's the most awesome thing they'd ever seen. And I totally knew that was true. I totally knew that that was the most awesome thing they'd ever seen, and very likely still is. And I also knew this, that I had done something that I was incapable of doing when I was sober. I had acted in a way that was extemporaneous that I had never before felt capable of doing. Normally, I was completely rooted in fear, like paralyzed by fear. And it was a sort of lack of paralysis that you only become aware of when suddenly you have complete and total mobility to move through life unaffected. And like, that's what I knew at the age of 10, is that alcohol had done that. And I probably wouldn't have articulated it in that same way, but fundamentally, I knew that that's what had happened and that my life had been changed. Now, I think similar to how Bill describes a spiritual experience, if that wasn't how your first drink was, that doesn't mean you're not an alcoholic. But I do think if that was your first experience with drinking, there is a good chance you are an alcoholic. And I would basically chase that same experience up until I would get sober. And when we were working step 1, my sponsor was like, "Tell me a story about when you were powerless when you were drinking. Like, tell me that story." And the story I told him was this. When I was 18 years old, I was freshly released from juvenile hall. And at that time, I was living in downtown Seattle. And my goal at that time was to become a street junkie, which to my great delight, I had succeeded in doing. And I was sitting in a car next to a friend of mine. That friend was holding a loaded gun to my head and threatening to kill me, which was ultimately making me question our friendship. And I had one of those really brilliant plans where it's like, why don't you rip off your drug dealer friend and that will somehow get your life on track. And the weird thing is, like, that's for some reason not an uncommon story in AA. Like, we all at one point in time seem to entertain that exact plan. And some of us do and some of us don't. And it generally ends up the same way. But in the time that he was threatening to kill me, I was pretty sure he was going to. One, because I think he had killed people before. We were parked next to a body of water. It was late at night, and he had a loaded gun pressed against my head and was like, I'm going to kill you. And this was the evidence I was using. And at the same time that this was happening, the thought that was going through my head was, please just pull the trigger. I don't know why it is that I do the things that I do, but I feel like I can't stop doing them. I don't really remember the last time I've had a relationship with really anybody. My family has literally disowned me. I don't have people left in my life. In the mornings when the sun is coming through the corrugated steel that covers the dumpster that I spend most of my nights sleeping in, and then spend the rest of the day wandering the streets doing whatever it is that I need to do to get what I need to get a couple moments of just apathetic peace, and then am unfortunate enough to catch a glimpse of myself in a storefront window and then cringe with disgust with the fact that I lack the courage to blow my own head off. Please just pull the trigger. And at the exact same time that I was thinking that, the other thought that was going through my head was, I wonder if I can pop the door handle and roll out of the car before he pulls the trigger. And for me, that was sort of the great internal alcoholic dilemma. Our book sums it up perfectly when it just simply says, for the average alcoholic, lack of power was our dilemma. Lack of power was our dilemma. And what my sponsor pointed out at that time was, he said, have you ever had an experience where you've had a plan, you've executed that plan successfully, and everything went to shit directly thereafter? And everybody who was unfortunate enough to be with you, all of their lives got worse as a result of you successfully executing this plan. And I was like, yeah, that basically sums up the last couple years of my drinking. Probably a lot longer, but that's all I'm aware of. And he said, that is a form of powerlessness when all of your best moves and all of your best plans constantly degrade the quality of your life. And I saw that for what it was. It was like, you've got no moves on your own. And lack of power was my dilemma. Everything that I tried, it was like I lacked the power to propel my life in a direction that ever sort of resulted in any form of contented, either drunkenness or sobriety. Because even if I had been capable of kind of being contentedly drunk all the time, I probably would have gotten sober at a much later age. But at the age of 19, that was the bottom that I was scraping. And Dustin said I can go a bit longer. So I'll share a couple stories about the steps and then talk about today. One of the things that was super important was my inventory. And I did my 4th step and I went into my 5th step. And I remember being amused by the amount of people that would say, hey, aren't you afraid of your 4th step and your 5th step? And I was like, no way, because I'm totally not going to tell the truth. So who cares if I'm writing this down? It's not like I'm going to like be honest. But that was kind of what it was like. It's like, it's just a list. I'm not going to like actually read this to you. So it's like the list that I read to my sponsor in my 5th step is not going to be this one. It's going to be some made up bullshit. And I'm totally not afraid. In fact, I kind of look forward to doing that. And we got to my 5th step. And for whatever reason, I read my actual 4th step. And at the end of that actual 4th step, it was still not the entire thing. And my sponsor looked at me and he's like, okay, nice work. Now tell me all the things that you didn't write down. And I was like, man, this guy knows me so well. What I later found out is literally asked everybody that question, which I do too when I do inventories, and generally is almost always accurate, that there was stuff people didn't wrote down. And just the act of saying, I am a guy who for some reason knows you didn't write stuff down makes people tell you. And here's what I didn't write down. And this will kind of gloss through in a general way some of what happened in my life when I was drinking. my family disowned me when I was a teenager. They did that because they had no other choice. I was constantly getting in trouble with the law. A lot of stuff happened, and sort of the net of that is I ended up in a juvenile hall for 2 years. That place was, let's say, very poorly run and was eventually shut down by child protection agencies for rampant accusations of physical and sexual child abuse. I was one of the people that was part of that finding. And as a result of that, the state at the time, as a form of reparation, decided to expunge my criminal juvenile record, kind of as a way of saying, sorry this happened, we're going to expunge your record. At the time, that didn't seem like a lot. And also in hindsight, I wish I had asked for more, but it was actually a pretty big deal because if I have time, I might talk about it, but I had a pretty serious juvenile record, the type that actually follows you into adulthood. And if it had not been expunged, I literally would not be your speaker because I wouldn't even have been allowed to come into Canada. That's one of those things that would have followed me into my life and drastically altered what my life looks like today. I remember sitting with my social worker during this terms, and he was like, this is a pretty big deal for you. You have a clean slate. Like, you have the opportunity to live a completely new life. And I didn't understand him at that time, but that's what happened. I was also homeless for a long period of time, and I did a lot of things that I wasn't proud of, and a lot of weird stuff happened to me. And it was stuff that at the age of 19, I was like, this is embarrassing to talk about. Like, why would I need to tell like another adult man this stuff to stay sober? That doesn't even make any sense. But after my sponsor was like, now tell me the things you didn't write down, it occurred to me if I really wanted what he had, I had to get honest for the first time in my life. So against my better judgment, I told him everything. And at the end of that, he did this awkward thing where he put his hand over my hand and was like, I'm sorry that stuff happened to you. Like, in a perfect world, that stuff really shouldn't happen to any kid. But fortunately, or maybe unfortunately for you, that's no longer an excuse to live the way that you were living. And for me, that was the first glimpse into this idea that I could live a life where I could crawl up beneath the weight of the past that I felt that there's no way out of. I saw that accountability that was being talked about in the big book. I had kind of gone through life with this idea that in order for me to ever find some form of kind of peaceful sobriety, all these people in my life would need to change. But what my sponsor was pointing out was ultimately the only person that needed to change was me. And having begun to develop this relationship with a higher power, I began to realize that that was possible, that I could change. I was capable of that. And that was my experience with the inventory. For the sake of argument, I worked the rest of the steps and kind of continue to do so by constantly taking other guys, and now sometimes women, through the steps. That is how I continue to work the steps, and I have a different experience every single time that I do it. But for the sake of argument, I did work all the steps, and I'll talk a little bit more about what it's like today. One of the cooler things I achieved in life was like having a career, which, to be honest, is actually not super important right now. I don't even know if I'll have a career come the fall. The industry I work in is in a lot of, I think similar to a lot of people, the industry I'm in is really unstable right now, but I'm currently working and hope to do so. But I remember I had this one job prior to getting sober, downtown Seattle. I'd gotten a job working at like Subway sandwiches, and it was a job you get where you're like, I'm just going to show up to work. I'm going to try to be sober. I'm going to put my head down, and it's going to change my life. And I couldn't do that. And to be honest, no offense to anyone who works at like a sandwich making place, but it's totally the kind of job you can do when you're high. I mean, unless you can't, which was my case. I would come to work just absolutely out of my mind. At that time, I was doing a ton of methamphetamines, and I wasn't even really high. I was just sleep deprived for like several days at a time. If you've ever done a lot of amphetamines and not slept for a while, you know that you're not exactly high. You're just kind of simultaneously existing in a completely different reality. And I came into work this one time, and I was doing this thing where it was like I felt that the sandwich making system they had was too complicated to navigate, so I would just do what a true sandwich artist would do, which is just make my own. And this guy came in and said this thing that like blew my mind. He looked at me and he's like, "No onions." And right when he said that, I just shifted over into whatever that parallel reality is. And I found myself standing at the end of like this tunnel me at one end, him at the other, and there's just spinning vortex between us, and one word being whispered over and over in this hypnotic house beat: onions, 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 onions. And then suddenly I snapped out of it, and the guy's looking at me weird, and I look down, and there's just a piece of bread with like a pile of onions, and he's like, "What is this, a fucking joke?" And I was like, "I don't know, is this a joke?" And that was like the best level of employment I had up until that time. And I came in, I went back to school as an adult. I studied architecture. I did really well, which I should have because I was an adult. And I got into that career and I busted my ass. I became an associate partner at a small firm that I love working at. And I do good work. And I've built a career out of being someone who's known as ethical, hardworking, and honest, and someone that can work with anyone. And that blows my mind. And sometimes I think, oh, if only they knew who I really was. But the reality is that is actually who I am. And it's weird. I mean, that's who I am. That's who I am in the workplace, and that's who I am like everywhere. And that's been crazy. And I am an active member of AA. If you go to a meeting in Toronto, like any meeting, and you talk to someone, chances are you will eventually find somebody that knows who I am and how to find me. I don't say that to impress you because, frankly, that's not that impressive. And I don't tell you that because I'm a particularly likable person. I tell you that because I think that's an affect of how present I am in my recovery community. I do a lot of speaking, but that's just one of those things where I think it's kind of one of the lowest forms of sobriety that I can do, actually, or service in sobriety. That's not, I barely consider that service, to be honest. But I am active on a way that I believe, to the best of my ability, repays the debt to the dudes that were in my early days doing that thing in meetings where they were talking to newcomers and they're inviting them into their lives. And they were saying, this is what I have. This is how I got it. And they were transparent about what they did. They were transparent about how their life was great, and they were transparent about how at times their life wasn't great. And that is ultimately sort of the model that I have based my sobriety on. And I've had a lot of fundamentally incredible moments in sobriety, and at times really, really difficult times in sobriety. I mean, you can't go through life for like 2 decades and have all great times in sobriety. And if that's the bar of whether or not you stay in AA, you're bound to get disappointed, because the message of AA isn't that you will never again feel pain or you will never again face difficulty. It's that you will, and you'll be able to walk through it sober. I remember, I'll tell this last story that literally sums up where I am today. Okay, so last year, I've now told you a little bit about my story. I never wanted to have kids. My fear was, through just the miracle of biology, I would have someone that was exactly like me, which I was terrified of. I would never hit a kid, but I feel like I might hit a 16-year-old version of me. And I was kind of like, I don't want to have a kid. If it's anything like me, I feel like that would be karma. And if God does exist, he's probably a punishing God. So I feel like the only loophole is to never have kids. I realize that logic is pretty much based out of fear, but that was what I came to with. When my wife and I were talking about kids, I said, I don't want to have kids. I feel like I come by that honestly because of some of the things that happened in my life. I don't know any other way to kind of change my mind, but I realize that that's an unfair condition to place on you. So unfortunately, if you want to have kids, you have to make that decision. Like, you have to tell me you want to do it, and I promise I'll go along with it. And you can argue whether or not that's actually fair, but that was just ultimately the best I could do. And eventually my wife was like, I want to have kids. And so I stuck by my word, and we did. And she got pregnant, and I was fucking terrified at first, like really terrified. After a period of time, I started to get into it and started to get really excited, and the planning and stuff. I still was terrified, but I started to get into it. And we went to this one ultrasound, and they're doing the ultrasound, and they throw that up on the screen. And I have that kind of cliched experience where I'm looking at it and I'm like, holy shit, this is like the miracle of life. Like, we did that. And I saw it. And then the technician stopped for a second and was like, I'm so sorry, there's no heartbeat. And I had this experience where it felt like I just left my body and was like looking at myself, and it was like, there is a guy who just got emotionally devastated. And I didn't know at that time that I was capable of that level of like emotional despair in any given moment. And it's kind of that thing where you don't know how you feel about something until it's suddenly removed. And it was horrible. And some of the other poor timing about that is we were literally leaving later that day for 2 weeks for this thing in like, vacation in Europe. And they were kind of like, you can go on it if you want, but unfortunately what's going to happen is you will probably have a miscarriage in the hospital when you're there, which is totally fine because you're going to a place where there's hospitals and people miscarry all over the world. And if you want to do this, I think you should. And so we were like, okay, let's go on this trip. And so we did. And we went to meetings like normal and we did kind of what we know. My wife is also in the program. We shared about the experience. And I went to this meeting in Barcelona and spoke. And this was only like, I guess, a couple days after that. And I just shared very raw about what was going on and where I was at. And it was a difficult talk for me. And at the end of it, this guy came up and introduced himself. And I was reminded of this time that I was flying out of Chicago. And while we were flying out of Chicago, the plane either hit a wind shear or it had a bird strike and one of the engines went out. And the plane did this thing where it suddenly dropped out of the air and made the sound that things make when they're really heavy and suddenly start falling out of the air. And the pilot comes on, he sounds like scared. And the woman next to me is gripping the thing and she starts saying the Lord's Prayer out loud. And I put my hand over her hand and said the prayer with her. And at the end, turned to her and said, everything's going to be okay. And then smiled like a maniac. I don't know if I actually helped her, but I felt surprised by the fact that in that moment of crisis, the only thing that I felt compelled to do was try to help somebody because I honestly did feel that everything was going to be okay. Not like we weren't going to die, but that like fundamentally that would probably be okay. It's like there's literally nothing you can do. And I thought at the very least I could offer this woman some peace if that is what happens. And at that meeting, this guy came up to me and he's like, did you get sober in Los Angeles? And I was like, I did. I hadn't mentioned that. He's like, you don't remember me, but I was friends with your sponsor. I remember you quite well. We actually spent a lot of time together in your early sobriety. And I was like, and then I recognized him. And he told me his own experiences with that. And at the end of it, he took my hand and he like held it awkwardly and was like, I just wanted to tell you that everything's going to be okay. And I love moments like that in AA, like this is that wild, crazy stuff that happens unexpectedly. For me, those are kind of like the spiritual path type weird stuff that happens in AA. We all have crazy stories like that. And I hold that to my heart, this idea that everything's going to be okay. We're expecting in November now, and everything is okay with that. And it's an exciting and really scary time to kind of go into that. But here's the crazy thing. One of the fears I had about this was always that other cliche of like, oh, I don't want to have a kid come into this effed up world. I would say right now in my lifetime, arguably, this is kind of one of the most effed up times the world has ever experienced in many ways. And for whatever reason, I don't feel afraid. Like I don't have that fear that I thought I would have. And I guess for me, that goes back to what I love about what we've done as a fellowship in this time, like how we've like risen to the challenge of putting ourselves out there in this way so that when newcomers get sober, we can tell them like, you don't need to be afraid. Everything's going to be okay. And I don't know, I feel pretty cool to be part of something like that. It's 9:15, so I think I'll end there. And I just want to say thanks again, everybody. I hope to see some of you in person at some point in time, but thanks.
Wow. Thank you so much, Josh. That was a fantastic talk. I could listen to you talk forever, man. I've had the pleasure of hearing you speak a few times, and it's better every time for me. It's just excellent. Congratulations, bro. Congratulations to you and your wife. It's just fantastic. Tonight, I've asked Shauna R. from Saturday Night Speaker Series to thank you
I'm an alcoholic. My name's Shauna. Josh, thank you very much. The first time I met Josh was my 15-year medallion. Called you up out of the blue and said, hey, my 15-year medallion's coming up. Would you speak? And he came out, the Port Whitby group, and he spoke. That was the first time we met. And then he asked me to speak at the ORC shortly after that, and then our paths have not crossed again until tonight. But that's the beauty of AA. I know that I will meet somebody, and then eventually one day I will see them again. Thank you very, very much for coming and sharing with us tonight for our last meeting of the Saturday Night Speaker Series. I could relate to a lot of what you said. Talking about how even though everything's shut down, AA still fills the void. And instead of just saying, well, I guess we can't meet, it was, what's the next step? Because that's what we've learned. What's the next step? You also talked about the newcomer's interpretation of things that go on here, which can be quite interesting. That's how it was for me as well. And talking about your sponsor being the first person that you trusted to be able to go through your fifth with. So a lot of similarities in our journey. So on behalf of the committee and everyone here tonight, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Josh. So one of the things I always remember about listening to Josh speak is that he can explain the seriousness of the disease, but he also leaves you in stitches, man. You have a great sense of humor. So thank you for sharing that with us tonight, as well as your heart. That was just great. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. And I just want to remind everyone, I'll touch on anonymity. Anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all of our traditions. What you see here, what you hear here, please let it remain here. And tonight, to close off the meeting, I would ask Peter C. to read A Vision for You.
Good. Hello, everyone. My name is Peter. I'm an alcoholic. And just on behalf of the AA members and friends of AA, Dustin and Shauna and all the members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for all the hard work you've done in making this series just spectacular. Just thank you very much. So, A Vision for You. Our book is meant to be suggestive only. We realize we know only a little. God will constantly disclose more to you and to us. Ask him in your morning meditation what you can do each day for the man who is still sick. The answers will come if your own house is in order. But obviously you cannot transmit something you haven't got. See to it that your relationship with him is right, and great events will come to pass for you and countless others. This is the great fact for us. Abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Admit your faults to him and to your fellows. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find, and join us. We shall be with you in the fellowship of the Spirit, and you will surely meet some of us as you trudge the road of happy destiny. May God bless you and keep you until then. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Excellent. So you can now unmute yourselves. Thank you to everyone for coming. It has been a tremendous experience. This thing. I'm gonna miss it all, and I hope to see everyone along the path. As we trudge, right?